Hey guys, this is my journal club for August. So I chose to do the article called Fasting, Circadian Rhythms, and Time Restricted Feeding in a Healthy Lifespan. The primary authors on this are Walter D. Longo and Satchidananda Panda. And this was on cell metabolism perspective. So the first thing that attracted me to this paper was the topic. Obviously, it discusses time restricted feeding and how it can influence metabolism and health, and the practical applications of this in the future can be applied to future inexpensive treatments, and may also be effective in treating weight loss. It also has an effect on like chronotherapeutics and things like that. So I'll talk about that later. The way I came across this article was on the Circadian Rhythms Canvas page. So first thing, describe the study and describe the research question. So this article actually it's a perspective, so it talks about many different articles. It doesn't actually do the research itself. It just discusses it in a way. It's like a meta-analysis. And then the research question, there wasn't really a specific one that they kind of said, but one that I kind of put together based on what they were talking about is, so does restoring a fasting period or switching to a diet that mimics fasting an effective treatment strategy for several chronic diseases and help promote a healthy lifespan? So pretty much they're just asking, does time restricted feeding promote good health and things like that. So the next question is state the importance, the relevance, or context of the question. So the question is relevant because it's going to help guide practitioners in how to advise their patients and how to lose weight, or if patients come to us asking about these new, I guess they would be fad diets now, but it would be time restricted feeding where you like eat all of your calories in like an 8-hour time period or something like that. So it can help us advise our patients in that way. And then it can also help us to guide patients with, like, for example, someone struggling with a chronic disease like diabetes. We could push them towards this direction of, doing time restricted feeding, reduced calorie. And this type of diet may be a viable option for a lot of people based on their schedules. So the next part is describe the methods. As I said earlier, this was a perspective article, so they didn't do any research themselves. I guess the methods would be that they read many different articles and compiled the information together. And from what I could tell, all of the articles and research papers that they were reading were valid, but there was many of them, and I did not go through all of them. So I'm going to skip down to summarize the primary results. So they talked about several different things here. The first part of the paper, they talked about the background of time restricted feeding and the history of it, and over time, like where the science has come. And I'll skip over that part, and I'll talk more about the questions they asked and the answers to them. So first, I'll say, so for evidence for physiological importance of robust circadian eating patterns come from rodents. So they discussed rodents for a while. And they pretty much concluded from this that restricting access to high-fat food to only 8 to 12 hours per day does not only reduce overall caloric intake compared to animals fed freely, but improves the circadian rhythms and helps prevent or reverse metabolic diseases. And that's what they pretty much concluded with their studies of rodents and the articles that they found. So the next question, or the next topic they talked about, was intermittent feeding and periodic feeding. So they concluded that for intermittent feeding and periodic feeding and the prevention and treatment of chronic diseases in humans, caloric restriction is superior in causing loss of body weight compared to intermittent feeding, but both interventions have similar effects on the reduction of visceral fat, insulin, and insulin's resistance. Neither caloric restriction or intermittent feeding had significant effects on glucose levels. So the applications may be limited in metabolic syndrome because of that, because if it's not affecting glucose levels, that feeds a lot into what goes into metabolic syndrome, especially with diabetes and whatnot. But there are effects with the visceral fat, insulin, and insulin resistance. So that is something that they said future research probably even needs to be done for. They also discussed periodic fasting with different inflammatory conditions, for example, periodic fasting and rheumatoid arthritis. An article that they found says periodic fasting reduces the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis, but results reversed once the person was returned to a normal diet. So they did better while on fasting diet, but then they got worse once they went back to normal. And also with hypertension, periodic fasting had lower systolic blood pressure even after return to normal diet for some time. But both intermittent fasting and periodic fasting have potential applications for inflammatory and cardiovascular diseases. So they did see some benefit with that. And then the next topic was periodic fasting applied in the form of moderate calorie or fasting mimicking diets can promote a rejuvenating effect on different systems, leading to improvement in markers and biomarkers and risk factors for disease, particularly in subjects with elevated baseline levels for these markers. The next thing they concluded was feeding/fasting rhythms enhance the robustness of the amplitude of oscillation of circadian activator and repressor components. And this was based on the part I talked about earlier, where they were talking through the history and the science of it. The next conclusion that they made was they reviewed an article and in a retrospective study examining the self-reported duration of overnight fasting and breast cancer incidence. A prolonged overnight fasting period correlated with reduced breast cancer risk. So that's interesting. And that's something that they said they should be investigating more too. They also discussed chronotherapeutics briefly, and they said since eating patterns determine the phases of circadian rhythms in peripheral organs, timing of medication relative to the timing of food intake will likely impact the prognosis. And this is something that we're going to discuss later in class. And then the last thing that they concluded was, thus, extensive and conclusive experiments should be performed in model organisms to understand molecular mechanisms of action and demonstrate efficacy, which will serve as a foundation for randomized clinical trials. So they pretty much concluded with a lot more research needs to be done. That has randomized control studies and control trials, which is pretty much what they concluded. But they laid the foundation by doing all the research on these different articles and saying, here's what seems to be happening now. This is what we can be doing in the future. The next question is, describe why you think the results can or cannot be applied to your own patients or situations. These results can definitely be applied to my future patients, since I'll be going to OB. For instance, somebody who has diabetes, who wants to get pregnant, I can advise them on different, first of all, reducing their calorie intake, but also doing intermittent fasting or periodic fasting, since it does look like it seems to have benefits in reducing weight and helping with metabolic syndrome. And then I can also advise my patients who come to me asking about time-restricted feeding and if that actually works. And then the last question is, conclude with your own decision of the utility of the study in your practice. And personally, I think this is very interesting. Time-restricted feeding is something that I myself would be willing to try, mostly because it works with my schedule and we're all pretty busy. And I think that's something that I can make work, and I would like to see the effects on myself in terms of like sleep, energy, weight loss, and my overall health and well-being, and seeing how this works. But I do think this has a lot of implications, and could future research, I do look forward to seeing that and seeing what the results come out. Thank you.